Hey, it's Cynthia, and this is Believer's House Morning Devotions, and we are looking at First Timothy, actually Second Timothy chapter 1. And I want to share with you today a little bit out of this chapter. This chapter is a letter from Paul to Timothy, which would make sense. And he was imprisoned in Rome, and he'd been imprisoned and let go, and imprisoned and let go. And we know this is a time in which he believes, which is actually shown out later in 2 Timothy, that he doesn't have long here on this earth. And we do know that he was eventually executed and condemned at the command of Nero. So this is one of the last letters that, maybe the last letter that Paul wrote while he was in prison just before he was executed. And this letter is written to Timothy. And in this particular chapter, Paul is speaking to Timothy, and he tells Timothy to be bold. And he says in verse 6 to stir up the gifts in which are in you. And Timothy apparently was gifted and a valuable man for the kingdom. Obviously, he was set over the city, all of the churches, the network of churches over the city of Ephesus. But he seems to, because of the command throughout the scripture for him to be bold, he seems to be a person who's timid. And it's also true that he had this heavy responsibility because he was over the work that Paul had planted in Ephesus. And it was a large area, and it covered a whole region. And so he had an enormous responsibility, Timothy did. And Paul was a man who was a person who loved deeply, and Timothy was considered one of his spiritual sons. But he was also a man who never shied away from any kind of confrontation. And so a significant example would be when he publicly rebuked the Apostle Peter in Galatians chapter 2. So he wasn't a mild person, and he was not afraid of speaking out when something was wrong, and not necessarily just to sinners, but in any situation to people who had doctrine wrong or were thinking or preaching in a wrong way. So it's important that we recognize that people are at all different places, but for some, the last thing they need to hear is you need to be bolder. Because that's not their problem. But others may come a place, those people that don't need boldness, maybe they need to, or maybe those that aren't so bold need to stir up the gifts that are within them. And that's what I see here in the scripture in 2 Timothy chapter 1. He says to be bold and get going and go for it. And this was something that Paul was telling to Timothy, and we can take for ourselves. So sometimes people who appear bold are really just good at pretending. And they use a confrontational style, it's in-your-face attitude to mask a lot of pain. And so we need to really ask God, about those kinds of people. We need to check people's fruit. We don't need to be in judgment, but we can watch their fruit. But we need to look at ourselves and say, God, am I the person that needs to have the gifts that you've given to me stirred up? And do I need to be using them for your kingdom? And have I let maybe the embers of the fire of those gifts that were put into me, have I let them die down? Because God gives them to us, but he doesn't expect us, he didn't create those gifts as robotic, that he pushed a button and they worked. Our will needs to be engaged, and we need to pursue the use of those gifts, and we need to allow those gifts to rise to the surface and to be used. It's not something that we wait passively for God to use them in us. We use them because God gave them to us. It's like giving us a tool. Now we have the tool. We have the choice to pick up the tool and use it or not. And unfortunately, in the church today, we have so many that are not using their gifts. And the gifts are given for others. They're not for us. They're not to make us look good. They're not to make us shine. It's not to call attention to who we are. But the gifts that God gives us are given to us to encourage other believers and to bring others into the kingdom. So the word stir up is a Greek word, and it's translated to kindle afresh. And I've talked about this once, that I think maybe even when I was talking in 1 Timothy, that we need to keep our gifts aflame. And so we need to make sure that we're stirring those things up in ourselves. And we see here that 2 Timothy talks about not being in fear and in using the boldness that God gave us in comparison to living a fearful life. And so I think that's an important part that we need to remember and something that we need to apply in our life. If we need more boldness, we need to stir up the flame and get those things going, right? And we do that by spending time with the Lord. And if we have a gift and we've let the embers, the coals die down, we need to stir it up and maybe put a little bit more wood on the fire and get that thing going. So that's just what I wanted to share with you today. God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow.